As words rise from the pages of a book into our consciousness, the world around us is expanded and refined. The mission of the Lafayette Library and Learning Center Foundation is simple yet powerful: to sustain the library as a community resource that offers enriching experiences for all ages. Thanks to the generous support of our donors, the Distinguished Speaker Series brings some of the most dynamic and compelling storytellers of our time to share their wisdom, inspirations, and insights with us. Distinguished Speaker Series guests share tales of determination, activism, grief and forgiveness, contemplation, and the joys of childhood. The Library Foundation is proud to offer audiences of all ages and backgrounds continued opportunities for lifelong learning, now and for generations to come.
Welcome. My name is Sarah Blumenfeld, and I'm the Development and Programs Director with the Lafayette Library and Learning Center Foundation, and your host for today's event. In addition to programs like today, the primary role of the foundation is to provide the Lafayette Library with funding for additional hours, staff, and the materials needed to meet the needs of the communities we serve. I'd like to thank our donors who are joining us today and everyone out there who made a donation when they registered for today's event, as well as our partner bookstore, Orinda Books, for their generous support. We will have a Q&A as part of our program today, so I want to encourage you to ask questions by writing them at the bottom. I also want to remind you that we do have two speakers, so if you can change your view to gallery view, you'll be able to see them both clearly. Our guest today is New York Times bestselling author Joyce Maynard. She'll be discussing her new novel, Count the Ways, with author Meredith Hall. Meredith is the author of the critically acclaimed novel Beneficence, published in 2020, and a 2008 New York Times bestselling memoir, Without a Map. Joyce Maynard's writing career spans the decades of her life from age 18, when she wrote a cover story for the New York Times Magazine, to her latest memoir, The Best of Us, which shares the love and loss at age 59 of her one true partner, Jim. Joyce is the author of 18 books, including 2 novels adapted for film, Labor Day and To Die For. In addition to her writing, she's the founder of Right by the Lake, a workshop on the art and craft of memoir held at Lake Atitlan, Guatemala. Joyce has graced the Lafayette Library Community Hall stage in person many times, and having her here today is a lot like welcoming back a friend we've missed spending time with. Her novel, Count the Ways, is a mesmerizing story of family, from the hopeful early days of young marriage to parenthood, divorce, and the costly aftermath that ripples through everyone's lives. Themes of love, loss, grief, and forgiveness in Count the Ways give us a lot to talk about today. So let's get started, and let's welcome Joyce and Meredith. Hi, Joyce. Hi, Meredith.
Hello. Hi. Hi, Joyce.
Oh, we can't hear you, Joyce.
Joyce, you're...
How are we now?
Yes, we're good.
I said, this is really like a homecoming. Thank you, Sarah, so much for that beautiful introduction. And thank you all for tuning in. I wish I could be there up on that stage in that room I know really well. And I know there would be familiar faces to look out at. So I hope I'll hear from some of you in the hour to come. And I'm also so grateful to be sharing this program with a writer and friend I so admire, Meredith Hall, who lives in Berkeley, but I actually met her through the pages of her spectacular novel, Beneficence, which I want to recommend to you all. And I can't wait to talk to Meredith and to you all. Normally, I give a long reading, but I don't really want to do that tonight. I want to get talking. So Meredith, let's get to it.
Let's talk about your extraordinarily beautiful book. It's such an honor to talk to you about it, Joyce. So I have a lot of questions for you. Several of them are about Eleanor, this character you've written who is an artist. She's a wife and a mother, a homemaker on a farm. You are very generous in bringing Eleanor to us in all her capacity to love. And she loves well. She loves fiercely her husband and her children in this home. But she also fails at love. There are specific moments of failure that we can identify, and they make us very uneasy. I think that you've been incredibly brave at showing this character that we come to care about so much at those moments of failure. Can you talk about that?
Oh, absolutely. I'm most interested in human beings, not at their most heroic moments, but our most human, flawed moments. And I say that partly as a person who spent the first years of her life trying very hard to conceal those parts of myself. I felt that I had to look perfect to the world. And it was the experience of writing about my life and connecting with readers that taught me the lesson. I'm sure you know it, Meredith, that the moment that we most connect is when we reveal not the glorious heroic aspects of ourselves, but those moments when we fall short of heroism, but we're also forgivable. I like to say that I don't think I've ever written a single total villain in a book of mine or a single hero. Everybody contains aspects of both. Eleanor is a woman who is passionate and obsessed with family. And part of the reason is that she didn't have much family growing up herself. Her parents died when she was a teenager in an accident, but long before they died, she was somewhat abandoned by them. This is incidentally, sometimes some people speak of this novel as being very close to my life, and in certain ways it is. This part is most definitely not. I wanted to imagine a woman who had an experience completely different from one I've known of growing up with parents who actually were more interested in each other than their children. And what she took from that experience was obsession to create this family. The family was everything. And that certainly was an obsession of mine too, when I was young. Family, making a family. I used to say the only way I'd ever be part of a happy family was to give birth to one.
That's wonderful.
And I started kind of young, probably because I just couldn't wait. I just couldn't wait.
Well, I wonder if, I'm sure everybody who has tuned in tonight would love to hear you read something from this book.
Sure. And as I said before, our time feels so incredibly precious that I don't want to take a lot of it for the reading. And incidentally, I think some of you who registered for this event know that I recorded a longer passage from this book. So at your leisure, you can hear a longer passage read by me, but I'll read a short one right now. This, I should say that the novel spans the years from the early 70s, the Vietnam War going on, Watergate hearings. There's always the sort of the backdrop of national events in this very personal, particular story through to the 2000s. But we're speaking now of probably the 1980s, and Eleanor and Cam they're living on a farm in New Hampshire, as I did, raising my three children, and they've just had their third child, Toby. "We're outnumbered now," Cam had said, laughing after the birth of their son. Eleanor had loved this, loved the way their family, unlike the quietly lonely one in which she was raised, was loud and boisterous and always a little chaotic. She knew from observing the way Cam's parents greeted their son and even their grandchildren on their annual Christmas visit. And again, when they pulled down the driveway every August in Roger's Lincoln town car with clubs in the back for Roger's annual game of golf with his son, and matching sweaters for each of the children, and the same observations every year Look how you've grown, and how's school? That the home in which her husband was raised must have been similarly lacking in warmth. This was what Eleanor had wanted for her life, the constant whirl of activity, the small, warm bodies tumbling into her lap, the jumble of shoes by the screen door, which swung open and closed all day long as the children headed in and out, the chorus of their sweet, high voices calling out. And then Toby's, that had been surprisingly deep almost from the beginning. He never seemed like a baby, more like a very small man. The three of them piling into the bed after their baths, the smell of baby shampoo, Ursula flinging her arms around Eleanor's neck, Allison, the one who hung back, smoothing her brother's wet curls, Toby twirling his ribbon in his ear, his small foot stroking her own. Why did people think having a tidy home or a quiet one was such a great thing? To Eleanor, the sound of her family's voices was music, even when they drowned out her own, even when they drowned out her husband's. She saw the two of them, herself and Cam, like two whitewater rafters off on Class 5 waters. You didn't have time to debate your choices or question them once they were made. There was no space to think or even worry. You held on tight, paddled hard, and surrendered to the experience, hoping you'd make it to the spot, wherever it was, where you brought your craft into shore. But your heart beat so hard you thought your chest might explode. First you got wet. First the water swirled around you, tipped you over, or came close. You never knew if you'd make it, but you couldn't stop. Eleanor was too consumed with children and work to consider her goals in life. It continued to amaze Eleanor, the way her friend Darla, even in the middle of a messed up marriage, never lost sight of hers. Somewhere, somebody always needed her. Food, bathroom, shoelaces, lost toys, Barbies, rocks, Band-Aids, unwanted dresses, volcano dioramas, insects, Legos, popcorn, sorrow, joy again. Come look, come play. An event was not wholly real in her children's lives unless they told her about it, unless she'd borne witness. She knew every inch of their bodies, but seldom gave thought to her own. And though she knew this was not how women should live their lives, devoting themselves solely to the care of babies and children, and particularly the women of her generation who had challenged the old definitions of a woman's role, she harbored an almost guilty pleasure concerning her love of caring for her children, to the exclusion, or the vast compromise anyway, of her own sideline dream of making art, and to the detriment of her marriage, probably. Long ago, Eleanor had promised herself she'd never let a son or daughter of hers feel excluded the way she had. Instead, maybe, the one she relegated to last place was her husband. Somewhere along the way, she was losing sight of him. He was losing sight of her, too. Maybe the problem went deeper than that. Maybe she had lost sight of herself.
That's a wonderful passage, Joyce. You really lay out so much of the story in that short passage, her passion for her children and being at home, but this troubling sense that Eleanor carries that she somehow, even then, is starting to fail at something. She's failing to support her own passion for her art. She's failing to pay enough attention to her husband. She completely hands herself over to this joy of the great physicality and emotional life of her children.
And of course, she fails them too, as we do. You know, there's this whole, you and I talked, I think at one point, but not with others present, and I'd like to explore it deeper, about the whole concept of the good mother.
Yes, right.
And your novel also explores that one. And it's such a trap. There's no way you can ever be good enough. It's an impossible task, launching people into the world and protecting them. And it's almost, it goes with the territory that you will fail. She's terrified of that. She's terrified of hurting her children. She's terrified of seeing them hurt. And of course, the very fact that she is hurts them.
Yes, and the tragedy is that for all of that passion, the children, there is a breach between this mother and these children, and
Yeah.
it's very, very difficult. It's interesting to watch Eleanor maintain her dignity as she faces that breach, but it's devastating to her.
Yeah.
This leads us right into this question about Cam. So a tragedy hits this family, a very terrible event hits this family. And it happens because Cam, who has always been an extraordinarily fun and spontaneous and kind of zany dad, he's always the one getting the kids muddy and taking them into places that they might not go. There's something quite magical about Cam in every way, and he is a pretty magical father. But part of that is that for one moment he failed to pay attention. He was responsible for watching the children, and he fails for one moment to pay attention. And this terrible thing happens as a result of that momentary failure. Eleanor cannot forgive him for this. And ultimately, it's the weight, the impact of that event starts making its way through the family and causing a kind of almost a tsunami that hits the family. And she ultimately, in her failure to forgive Cam, really pushes that along. Can you talk about the role of forgiveness and whether this is, Eleanor speaks often as you move through the book, questioning, maybe I should have forgiven Cam. Maybe this is my failure. Maybe I needed to forgive him and I couldn't. So is it something she could have done or should have done? Are we able to forgive in those circumstances?
Well, one of the, of course, every novel I've written has my obsessions in it. Sometimes they're more veiled than in this one, but I will freely acknowledge that Eleanor's struggle was one of mine too. If your greatest dream is to create a family and that falls apart and you lose that, then it is almost inevitable that there will be grief and probably anger and bitterness. At least that was true for me. And it's one thing to know that bitterness has inhabited you, and it's another thing to rid yourself of it. I wanted, a novel is not about a state of being. A novel is the journey of characters who grow and change. Sometimes they fall apart, sometimes they go downhill. In the case of this novel, which I really do think is my most optimistic novel, Eleanor's journey is one that brings her to, and I'm not giving away the ending when I say this, but I will say it brings her to a place of forgiveness, and it's a long time in coming.
Yes.
And that it felt very good to be able to take her there. And maybe I couldn't have done that if I hadn't known something about that process myself in my own life.
Yes. Yes, and it's interesting because in that process, as Eleanor finally and slowly comes to terms with her ability to forgive Cam and see the events in a softer way, that's when her family, when the children actually are able to make reconnection and participate again with her.
And I want to say, again, I don't think I'm giving away the story when I say this, that one aspect of a woman's experience, could be a father's experience too, but I think it's usually a mother's, that I wanted to explore on the page, because I hadn't really seen it in a book, is in a work of fiction, is the dark secret of mothers finding themselves deeply alienated from the children they loved more than anything. And it happens more than we hear.
I
It
think,
happens
I
more
think you're
than we
absolutely right, Joyce. I think
Um,
this is quite a common experience.
you know, one of the things that I do besides, mostly I write, mostly I've written for 50 years, but I also teach writing, and I only teach memoir. I do not teach fiction, although I've written more novels than memoirs, but I love to teach memoir because I love to help other people, whether they call themselves writers or not, and often they don't, tell the story that they carry with them that they may never have shared, and make sense of it in the act of telling. And so I've been the beneficiary of this extraordinary gift of hearing women's stories. Women have entrusted me with their stories for over 25 years. I'll say, in a very personal note, because the Lafayette Library feels like a very personal place. I moved to Lafayette because of a writing student, Karen Mulvaney, who came to my writing workshop, and we became friends, and she invited me to the library, and ultimately Lafayette seemed like such a great town that I thought, oh, I'm going to move here with my husband, Jim, and we did. But I have been honored to listen, to be given the stories of hundreds and hundreds of women over 25 years. And one kind of story that I've heard a disturbing number of times is one that I explore in this book, of a mother sort of losing a child, not to death, not to injury, but to an emotional rift. And I wanted to look at that one.
I think that's extraordinarily brave of you. I think that your courage, looking at each of these characters, Joyce, we love each of these people. And yet we watch them, we love them. We love Cam, although Cam makes mistakes. We love Eleanor, although she makes mistakes. We love these children who struggle with the events as they grow up. And then as children do, they struggle with their parents, who are now separate from them. They're adults, and there's a different relationship that is forming or fails to form at that point. But I think it's very, very courageous of you to watch this. And I agree with you that these stories are more common than we see on the page, for sure.
We lose a lot when we grow older, my knees, for example, but one of the gifts, and we pay a high price for it, so we'd better appreciate this one, is just the perspective that comes with age. I'm 67 years old. My own divorce happened 32 years ago. And divorce is a story, an experience that I've circled around in numbers of my novels. Yes. Labor Day has a single mother. Where Love Goes has a single mother. In fact, Where Love Goes has some very similar situations take place. I didn't even know how similar until a friend who because I really forget my books. I don't reread them. But a friend who read the two books together said, there's a scene in Where Love Goes that is in Count the Ways too. And I thought, oh my gosh, no, but it's okay, because the scene might be the same, but the teller is not. And the perspective that I have is the perspective that you don't get any other way but by growing older. I think that's the case. And there's some poignancy to it. I look back, I don't give advice to younger people, hardly ever. I put out a story, and I trust readers to make of it what they will. And sometimes they will learn some things from it. But I certainly felt that there's an element of cautionary tale in this one. These are two people who lost their way, and maybe they didn't have to. Maybe they could have averted the complete disruption of their home and their family. I'll tell you a story that I worked on this book for 3 years. So it's 3 different summers of going over this story again and again. And I think 2 years back, I was working on it mostly just in summers until the pandemic, because as you know, I've been going back to to college, oddly enough, as an undergraduate. But I think 2 years back, when I was doing my second revision of this book, I woke up one morning, it just feeling really despair. And I thought, oh my gosh, my marriage didn't have to end. We could have saved our marriage. And I forgot, this is a novel. This is not my life. My marriage probably did have to end, but, and I can say that lovingly of us both, but I forgot that I had written a book. I cared so much about these characters, and I did sort of fall in love with Cam as I was writing it.
So in fact, it sounds as if Eleanor allowed you to explore that subject
It did.
in ways that you had not done before that.
He did. I mean, that is to me one of the gifts of writing fiction, that I get to put myself in another person's experience and then see how it looks. Years ago, I wrote a novel called The Usual Rules, who's from the point of view of a 13-year-old girl who was she was the daughter of a divorced mother. That theme had come up, a single mother. Her mother had died. And at the point that her mother had actually died on September 11th. And at the point that her mother died, she'd been very angry with her mother. And she had idealized her father, and she was angry about the divorce. And when I wrote that book, my own daughter was older than 13, but I learned some things about what it must have been like to have been my daughter, living through my own anger at her father. Yes. Completely different story. And I was alive, but I got to stand back and see it from somebody else's point of view, yes. Which, whether we write or not, is a good practice.
It's an extraordinary opportunity.
It is.
It is, yeah. So something you just said interests me. It suggests that perhaps you could not have written your early books any way other than they were written, and this book would not have happened when you were a younger woman.
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. The character of Eleanor is much younger than me, yes. But she's a character, and she's not looking back from the perspective of a 67-year-old, but I understand her as I didn't understand myself when I was her age in certain ways.
Yes.
I'll share with this audience in Lafayette what I don't usually say, but some of you who are listening were probably in the room for other events in Lafayette that I participated in over the years. And a number of them, my husband, Jim, my very good second husband, would have been sitting in the front row, proud of me as could be. And I lost him 5 years ago. We had a very brief, very life-altering time together, 4.5 years, start to finish. That actually was the subject of my last book, The Best of Us, which is a memoir. But if I were to name one experience that I'd like to think that I would have gotten to this place regardless, but for me, what informed my understanding of the need for forgiveness, I know was losing my husband, and living through, before I lost him, living through that painful but irreplaceable 19 months that we spent together as he was dying and as we were trying to save him. And so much slips away then, so much that used to seem important just doesn't anymore. And my God, if you go through an experience like that and you don't take anything of value, what an incredible waste.
Yes. Yes, I agree. It becomes a lens through which you can look at your whole life. Yeah. Joyce, you're leading in each of your conversations, you're leading right to something else I wanted to ask you about.
Right.
So there is a quality about you that nobody can miss. You have an exuberant love for life, an exuberant and extraordinarily warm and deep love for human beings. You have known a lot of loss in your life. How do you sustain that? What is the source of such love and such passion for the world?
Well, I am a resilient person, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It's my one life, and it gets me nowhere to complain about the things that I wish had been different. I lost my father when I was 27 and my mother when I was 35, and my marriage at the same time when I was 35. I mean, I don't think you get to this age without having sustained loss. I seldom meet a person who hasn't had some devastation take place. But I think of my mother here. I think of my mother, who was the daughter of Russian Jewish immigrants raised in the prairies of Saskatchewan, hard, cold winters. My grandfather, going bankrupt again and again in little country stores all across the prairies of Canada.
And resilience comes from, Joyce.
Yes, and she was a brilliant woman who hungered to get to university, and this was the Depression. They had no money. She was Jewish, that made it harder again. And she knew that if she wanted a scholarship to university, she'd better have a 100 average. So she studied math, even though what she loved was English, because you can't get a 100 average in English. So she took math classes, and she got her 100 average, and she got to university, and she got to graduate school, and she got to Harvard, Radcliffe, and got her PhD. And then, lo and behold, wife and mother of the 50s, couldn't get a job, sold encyclopedias door to door, tutored Latin for $1.
Where did children come into that part of her life?
She made me her career.
And
this was not a good idea. This was not a good idea.
Was she already in school when she had you?
No. She dreamed of a career as a writer, as an academic, as a teacher. I have seldom met a person with more zest for life and hunger for experience. And there she was in a small New Hampshire town, selling those encyclopedias and tutoring Latin. And her passion all was poured into my sister and me, but my sister kind of resisted it. So it was me. And I felt this huge obligation to deliver to her what she deserved and didn't get. But my mother, who seemed like she'd live forever, she was an incredibly indomitable force, was diagnosed with a brain tumor, glioblastoma, when she was 67, the age I am now. I'm actually now older than my mother ever got to be. And it fell to me, this is a long way around to answering your question, Meredith. It fell to me to deliver the news to her that she had this brain tumor, inoperable brain tumor. My stepfather couldn't bear to tell her. My sister couldn't tell her. And she said, "What's the matter with me?" And I said, "Mom, you have cancer." And she said, "What are they going to do about it?" And I said, "It doesn't look," my mother was a real stickler for telling the truth. I said, "It doesn't look like there's anything they can do about it, Mom." And she said, "You mean I'm going to die?" I think of this now. She was younger than I am now. At the time, I didn't know how young 67 is, Yeah. And I said, "It looks that way, Mom." And her first words hearing this news were, "Isn't life interesting?" That serves me well. That serves me well. You can't necessarily make life easy or happy or comfortable, but better make it interesting.
Yeah. Right. Here starts the next phase.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting to me. You are back at Harvard now.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, at Yale. I know that.
Same school I dropped out of in 1972.
And you're back now, full-time.
Not full-time. I will say not full-time. I'm living in New Haven. I left Lafayette. I hope to come back, but I rented out my house. I left Lafayette 3 years ago. Have not set foot in that place that Jim and I bought that is so dear to my heart for three and a half years now. And I don't take a full load of courses because I also want to do my work. So I take the minimum that is necessary to stay an enrolled student. And I audit a lot of other classes. So I'm studying everything I never got a chance to study before. Get my French better and study American history and psychology and political science and art. But it's not about getting the degree. It's
You're
not.
doing this, you're doing this the dream way, Joyce, that you take your courses.
I
and
feel very lucky.
you will get this acknowledgement and credential, but
I won't get the credential. I don't think I will ever get the credential. I think I'll probably be a junior forever, but
you're doing it on your terms, though,
Yeah.
as you graze your way through all the course
Yeah.
offerings and take whatever you want. I think it's pretty wonderful. But it is interesting to me that the drive to get back to college was strong enough, thinking about your mother's story, the drive to return to Yale and be in a learning environment again. Was that strong for you?
I never planned on it. I was pretty busy supporting my kids and putting them through college. I didn't spend all those years sort of thinking, when am I going to get back to college? I assumed I never would. But then about 9 years ago, it was while Jim was still alive, I discovered that a teacher at Yale was teaching my memoir, At Home in the World, in a memoir class. This is a memoir which some of you know was almost universally condemned. This was just about a banned book when it was published in 1998, because I did this unforgivable thing of writing about a great and important man who had chosen to enter my life and had not behaved in a heroic fashion. And I told the truth. That's all I did. But this teacher, Ann Fadiman, a writer I deeply admire, was teaching a class called Writing About Oneself, and she was teaching my memoir. And I discovered this, and I discovered that it was very controversial among her students. And some of her students at that point, times have changed so fast. This was pre-Me Too. Many of the students were outraged that I had told this story, which was the view of the literary community, And I offered to Anne, I said, would you like me to visit your class? I'd love to come. I will fly back east and do that. And she said, yes. And I went back to Yale. I hadn't been there in years and years and years. And I walked into that classroom, Meredith, and I just sort of melted. I thought, oh, what I missed. I didn't get to be that student at that table. And that was really the beginning. And Jim, my husband, then said, we can figure this out. We'll go back. And of course, we didn't get to go together, but I went. After his death, I went.
Yep. How wonderful that it was stepping back into that classroom to talk about the events that caused you to leave that classroom.
And incidentally, I will say that the tides have so shifted. By the time I visited Anne's class the following year, the students were no longer taking that old view, the woman is supposed to respect the great man and keep her mouth shut. That, thankfully, that view
that you were being self-serving in telling this story. Yes. Yeah. Well, where are we for time? We have a few more minutes.
It's so much fun to talk with you, Meredith.
I know. We need to do this often, Joyce.
We do.
You are an incredibly prolific writer. I'm very interested. I'm just at the beginning of this process at my age, older than you, and I am at the beginning of this process. I'm very interested in what the life of a writer is who's able to produce so much work. What happens? So Count the Ways is now in the world, just coming into the world. It's having this extraordinary reception. You must be feeling a great pleasure. I
am, but I also have the perspective that comes from having published many books and, having some that nobody read or almost nobody read or, were hugely criticized. This too will pass, and I'm already thinking, what will the next be?
So that's my question. How do you move from this project and you say you write primarily in the summer.
That was never the case until this Yale period. I write almost 365 days a year, but this particular novel I was doing just in the summer until the pandemic. Yeah.
Okay, so it still gives you a matter of months. You expect to be back in the saddle with a new book pretty shortly.
I do. You'd have to have grown up in my house to understand this. And I grew up, anybody who has read At Home in the World will know a little bit of what I'm speaking of. I grew up in a boot camp of writing. From the age of 3, my mother was instructing me on how to write. And she took my writing seriously. I couldn't even form the letters, but I was giving her dictation and she was typing. I did not replicate this with my kids. I want to say I don't believe in it. There were a lot of things we didn't get around to doing, like playing any sports. But there was no way not to learn how to write. My birthday present when I was 6 years old was a mimeograph machine so that I could create a newspaper.
Your own work.
I can always write. I never stopped, really. I stopped when Jim was sick. For those 19 months, I didn't write, but I've just about always written, and it's a huge gift that she gave me, that it's a very natural thing. I write to say what I know, but also to discover what I know. I mean, I'm sure you know what I mean.
Yes.
Meredith, would now be a good time to ask some questions and share?
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Okay. Hi, I'm going to rejoin you. I will just share first a couple comments from Amy in Kansas, who wanted you to know that she's attended every one of your plays.
I was thinking about you, Amy, and I was thinking, oh, I don't want to repeat myself.
Well, she says she's enjoyed them all. There's also a lovely note by someone named Sharon in North Carolina, and it's very long. So I just want to let Sharon to know that I'm going to save all of these and send it to you. And she's just really loves your work, and I think you know who she is. So
I do.
That.
I know a lot. You know, I have 5,000 Facebook friends, and I know them. I like every once in a while, I need to make a space for somebody, and I go through to try to eliminate, but I know those people. So yes.
Amazing. Amy also wanted to let you know that she was really touched by the Christmas story of when Eleanor goes on a date on Christmas Day. And I
blind date. Yeah. Her children, we should explain. She's not abandoning her children.
Right.
Her children are with their dad, and she is trying to make Christmas happen.
Mm-hmm. And her comment was just that she was happy to see them come back at the end of the story. And I thought that was a nice touch too. I was hoping you could talk about the Cork people, because for me personally, I had heard you talk about them before reading the book, and I couldn't quite figure out how they made sense in the story. But now that I've finished the novel, the more I think about them, the more significant I think they are. That and the waterfall, just this image of, you have Eleanor and the family, and then you have these Cork people, and no matter how carefully you tie them to their little boat, once you set them off in that water, we don't really know what's going to happen to them. So I thought that was just such a beautiful part of the book.
I should explain for those who haven't read the book yet that Eleanor and Cam live down the road from a brook and a waterfall, and she has the tradition with her children of walking to the waterfall almost every day. And in spring, she does something with her children that actually I did with mine. There's a weekend. I'll tell you, California people, how it goes in New Hampshire. There is a weekend when suddenly the snow has melted and the brook is just roaring. You can hear it, half a mile away. And they have a little tradition that they make little paper boats. And then, of course, once you've made a boat, you have to have a passenger for a boat. So they make little people out of corks, and they decorate them, and they give them names. And they bring them down to the brook, and they launch them in the brook, and then they run alongside the brook, which I did with my kids, and follow them, sometimes for a very long time. And sometimes the boats get stuck in the weeds, and sometimes they help the boat get back going again. Sometimes a Cork person falls out of a boat and they rescue the Cork person. And sometimes a Cork person is simply lost. And it struck me, not at the time that I used to do this with my kids, but later, that this was a metaphor for what we do as parents. Mm-hmm. We launch our little Cork people. Mm-hmm. The story of the Cork people sort of comes up a number of times in the novel. Originally, I was going to call this novel The Court People, and I was advised that nobody would know what I was talking about, and everybody would think I'd written a book about people from Cork, Ireland, or people who drank a whole lot. But I'll tell you that last winter, when I was still thinking that I might get to go on a book tour, I made 100 Cork People.
Wow.
And I am saving them. And maybe when I come back to Lafayette, when the book comes out in paperback, I will give away my Cork People. They're all different.
That's great. The other thing that I thought about this was it reminded me of a Jewish tradition called Tashlich, which is a New Year's where you go to a body of water and you cast out your sins. And you mentioned your mom being Jewish, and you ask for forgiveness. So it's sort of a cycle of life. And it made me think of Eleanor and forgiveness and the struggle to.
Sarah, I am really glad to hear that. I did not know that.
I always thought that was a great tradition. And I thought you might want to tell us a little bit about Crazy Town, because I think as a mom, we've all been to Crazy Town once in a while.
So, I talked about how Eleanor tries to be perfect and tries to protect her children, but the very act of trying to protect your children and be perfect can make you be really not perfect and burn out. It's something that I remember happening to me when I was in the thick of it with 3 young children at home all day. And it happens to Eleanor. In the book, she goes to Crazy Town a number of times. One story that comes up in the book is she's hosting a birthday party, and of course she's gone to great lengths. She had to make a perfect cake and everything else. And her daughter Ursula gets a crystal Barbie as a present and loses the shoe to Crystal Barbie, and Eleanor loses herself. She goes crazy trying to find that shoe and rips her house apart. And I will say, for anybody who used to read my old newspaper columns, Domestic Affairs, that one comes ripped from the pages of my life. I tore my house apart to find a Crystal Barbie shoe. And of course, the pain that my daughter might have experienced at the loss of a Barbie shoe was nothing compared to seeing her mother really act crazy. So Eleanor does that, and again, it's the secrets that we don't talk about that I want to talk about. It's those kinds of behavior. I'm looking to Marianne, to everyone. I love the Barbie shoe story. Oh, Marianne, I take your pick from my life. One time I circled a stretch of highway on a winter night in the dark with my high beams on for probably 45 minutes because the little Playmobil sword from my son's Playmobil pirate ship had fallen out the window. Well, he had been playing with it and it had fallen out the back of our station wagon. And I had to find that sword. And I finally, with the high beams on, I saw this little glittering object in the middle of the road, and I pulled over by the side of the highway and I raced out and was narrowly missed being hit by a truck.
Oh gosh.
So yes, crazy land. I know. I have to say, I don't go there anymore. It's a country I used to visit, and I don't go there anymore.
So we have another question from Lindell. She says, Joyce, I would love to hear you discuss the character of Toby.
Is that Lindell Hobbs?
McLean.
Lindell McLean from Michigan, I think. Yes.
His origin, and yes, he was such a wonderful character.
Yeah,
all through the book.
The character of Cam, was it?
Toby, and what his origin.
Okay, the character. Well, Toby's kind of a magical child. He's just different from any other child. And he has this deep voice, and he says things like God. He talks to God. He also talks to Mr. T. He has one webbed foot. He decides that he needs to have a violin and begins playing the violin when he's about 2.5. He has elements of my son, Willie, who is my youngest child, but he's not Willie. But he is this sort of otherworldly person. And, I don't have a favorite child, of course, but everybody in the family has a particular feeling for Toby that is different. He creates his own language. He talks in a language with his sister that nobody else can understand. And something happens to Toby. But Toby, in some ways, Toby is the heart of the book. Toby is the person who understands everything and for whom things are clear.
Yeah. So there's a comment from Bridget that says, I used to read your column when I was in my 30s, a mother of 2 young children. I had no role model. Having lost my mother at age 5, she was 30 and had brain cancer, and I tried to be a perfect mom too. I think that's one of the things I loved about your book was, I think, as mothers, as women, we can all find things to relate to in Eleanor and in the family.
And I'll just say, heaven forbid, Bridget, that I be your role model. I think it was closer that I just showed a picture of a woman living her life. And one of the functions of that column probably was, sometimes we can see in somebody else's behavior what we can't see in ourselves. I do not want to be her. I do not want to go there. And if that's the function that I serve, and maybe I probably might have done that for you at sometimes, I'm grateful that I got to do that.
So
a lot of women, when my marriage ended and I was writing the newspaper column at that point, and I had to say my marriage ended because I told the truth in that column. I got over 1,000 letters from women, many of whom were angry at me, and many of whom said, as long as I was managing to stay in what was clearly a complicated and difficult marriage, they felt hopeful for their own. And when mine ended, they felt abandoned and betrayed and scared. So role model, no, but sister, maybe. I like to be a sister and a friend.
So Tom has a question. One of the things you did in this book was you did weave a lot of historical events over the decades. Mm-hmm. And his question is, now that we're living through this pandemic, how has it changed the way you write, and what will you write about next?
Well, I was very fortunate. I always have to say, I recognize that I was fortunate. I don't take this for granted. I was not home trying to school young children while maintaining a career or a household or anything else. I spend time in Guatemala, in a little Mayan village in Guatemala on the shores of Lake Atitlan, and where I host a writing workshop. I've done that for 22 years now. And I had gone to Guatemala that March because things were just beginning to look bad, but in Guatemala there was no COVID. So I went knowing that some of the women probably wouldn't make it, but I was going to be there for the ones who did. And just about everybody who signed up for the workshop came, but a bunch of them had to leave almost immediately because they were closing the airport. I wasn't stuck in Guatemala, but I chose to stay. I actually chose to stay and invited 2 of the women at the workshop to stay on with me. It turned out we were all together, for me and these 2 32-year-olds, for 6 months. And that was a huge gift. So I finished this novel. I completely rewrote this novel. I worked really hard, and every night I came down, we had dinner together, me and I called them the girls, and I read out loud to them. And it's a wonderful thing getting to have an audience for your work. So I had the girls, and I had the perspective of 2 young women who hadn't lived through all those things. So it didn't change my writing, but it actually it made my writing more possible.
What is your next work going to be, fiction or memoir?
There are 2 things that I'm thinking about, actually. I mean, I'm always thinking about a lot of things. I want to write a book about writing memoir. I feel as if I know some things about teaching memoir after 25 years. I hope that I'll be writing about going back to college at age 65. And increasingly, every time I publish a book, I get letters from really devoted readers who say, oh, can you write a sequel? And usually it makes no sense because the book is over. But this time I actually have started thinking about a sequel to this book because I'm not quite ready to let these characters go. And a bunch of readers have said, oh, please write a sequel. And I may just do that first because I I really love these people and I want to spend more time with them.
I can understand that. So stepping back in the conversation, Georgia has a question about your mother, and she wanted to know if you thought your mother tried to be a perfect mom, or is this a concept and expectation that it is of our generation?
Yeah, I don't think maybe that's interesting. I don't think she tried to be a perfect mom. I think my mother's goal for me was to have a big, exciting, inspiring, and creative life. That was more important for her than that I have an easy life, that I make a lot of money, that she wanted me to, of course, this is what mothers do. I hope I didn't do this one with my children, but very often the trap is you want your child to have what you didn't have. Mm. And she wanted me to have a career and see the world. And she really gave me the tools to make that possible.
And we are all so grateful that she did, which I think is a great place for us to maybe wrap it up.
I would love, if it's okay with you, Sarah, and with everybody, I'd love to read just a very short passage that feels like a wrapping up kind of passage. Here was what Eleanor had learned over the years since she'd wept over a chickenpox scab on her daughter's scalp and the bald spot it left there, believing that event qualified as a heartbreak. The worst things, the ones that actually got you, were almost never the ones you spent your time worrying about. In all those years, nobody ever fell over the edge of the waterfall onto the rocks. That never happened, but plenty more did. So much else fell apart. So much floated away. So much had been broken. A person can survive a lot, it turned out. Those things change you, but you carry on. She turned her face to the racing water. Even now, in midsummer, it crashed over the rocks, but somewhere a mile beyond this place, or 3 miles, or 5, beyond the old people sitting in their cars listening to the radio, beyond the men with their fishing poles conferring among themselves on whether the Red Sox had a chance in the playoffs, and the young couples kissing or smoking weed, and the mothers nursing babies, beyond the teenagers daring each other to jump off the rocks, and the ones like Eleanor and Cam just standing there, taking it all in. All those human beings figuring out how to live their lives the best they knew. Count the ways. The brook would keep on running, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, but the water never stopped moving. It flowed all the way to the dam in town and beyond that to the river, which flowed to the ocean, which reached far as the horizon and even farther than that.
That's beautiful. Thank you
so much. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Meredith. I've so enjoyed our conversation, and I look forward to many more, and to more conversations with the readers of the Lafayette Library too. This is the closest I have to a hometown library, 3,000 miles away. That's the truth.
And we miss you, and we can't wait for you to be back here in person up on stage. And Meredith, you have an invitation to join us as well. We've had a really great audience today. I am going to share all the comments and questions with.
I will read everyone, be assured.
And thank you both very much. This has been a wonderful conversation, and we're really grateful to both of you. Take care, everybody.
Yeah. Bye-bye.